Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to use JavaScript. So I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to call it JavaScriptDemo. It's going to be an ASP.NET web application, and we're using Visual Studio 2015, so it'll be under Visual C# Web. We're going to make an empty web application. Notice I don't have any core references loaded for this project, just an empty application. And this empty application has very little in it. It has a little bit of a web config. I'm going to add an HTML page. You can add them here, or you can go to New Item. And we're going to call this one index.html. And just to test this page, make sure everything's working okay, which it usually is when you just start off a project. Notice that our IntelliSense works very well in Visual Studio for HTML. And I'm going to hit Control F5 to start this page. And we can see our HTML is just generating a simple page. So let's add another HTML page. This time I'm going to use the shortcut here. And we're going to call it What Can JavaScript Do? And these demos are based on the ones at W3 Schools. If you go to W3 Schools and go to these JavaScript libraries, there's a lot of simple, straightforward tutorials. They're not as in-depth maybe as other sites, but if you're starting, these work very well. And in this What Can JavaScript Do? We're going to just add some HTML, and I'm going to create a paragraph tag. I'm going to apply an ID attribute, and what this ID attribute does is make it so that I can get access to this element in my JavaScript. And I'm also going to add a button. And for our button, there's several events we can apply, but we're going to use the onClick. And this is where we're putting our JavaScript. We're placing it right in the onClick event. And so one of the a very useful method in JavaScript is the getElementById. It's part of this document class. And you can see that this document class gives you access to several elements on the page and the number of events associated with the page. But we're going to use this getElementById method. And since I need some double quotes here, I'm going to make my onClick event using single quotes. You can use those interchangeably to fix problems like that. And in getElementById, once you have the element, then you can see all the properties of an element. And so there's events, there's you can get access to child, parents, next sibling, node name. But what we want is inner HTML. And that's going to give us access to this section right here and allow us to modify this part of this code. So by getting ElementById and putting in the ID of the element we want, which in this case is demo, and then saying we want to change the inner HTML, and then the inner text for this button is just click me. So this is what's going to be displayed for the button. When you click on it, it's going to change what's in this paragraph tag up here. So I'm going to save that and we'll run that. And what you can see is here we have the H2 element, which is what can JavaScript do. Down here in the paragraph tag, we have JavaScript can change HTML content, which is what it currently is. And then we have this button. You can view page source, and you can see that looks very much like this. You hit click me, and now it says hello JavaScript. And so we can see that our button works. And with the quotes in JavaScript, we can swap these out. And it works the same. So you can use you can change your quotes out in order to not have to escape them out. So let's add another page. And one question is where can you place your JavaScript? So in this one, we place a JavaScript right in the onClick event. And that's okay for something simple, but imagine that you had a much more complex piece of code. You wouldn't want to have lines and lines of code just buried in the onClick event. So one thing that we can do is place our JavaScript in the head block. And so I'm going to add a script tag, and I'm going to declare a JavaScript function. And so similar to other languages, you have the name of your function, parentheses where your parameters would go into, and curly braces to delimit the block of code associated with this function. JavaScript requires this function keyword to declare your function. And we're going to do the same thing. We'll just make a function that will change the inner HTML of an element to just paragraph changed, so that we can see that something's been clicked and that we can modify things. And so this is in the head block, and we put a script tag here, and then in the body, we'll just put an H1 block so we can see where things are. And let's say that there's a paragraph here, and we're going to set an ID field equal to the key we're looking for here. So this function would change this paragraph. The question then is, where do we call it? We're going to again use a button. And so we're going to call my function here with the onClick. It cleans up this button element nicely, keeping all the mess up in the script tags. And once we have that, we'll run it. And so here we have our H1 element, the paragraph that's what it starts off as, and then the button with an onClick that's pointing to this function. When we click on it, we can see that it changes the paragraph. So our button can work, and it cleans up the code, and we can put the script somewhere else. Another feature that we can use in most browsers is called web tools or developer tools. And I'm going to hit, usually you hit F12 and you'll see a window show up on the right. And when we opened up this page, we can see the HTML over on the right. And notice that here it says a paragraph. When I click try it, we can see that Chrome Developer Tools shows us how the markup is changed. So this can be useful to see how your program is running. Another place we can place our JavaScript is in the body. So maybe the easiest way of doing this is I'm just going to copy this. Or I'm just going to add an HTML page. And we'll call this one JavaScript in body element. And we'll start off with the code that we had in the previous one. And rather than having the script here, I'm going to take the script and put it at the bottom. We'll run this. And we can see that it works the same. So why would we want to, what's the difference between placing them in the head block or in the bottom of the body tag? It has to do with how web browsers render content. Web browsers will generally render the content as they receive it. So if you place your script in the head element, then it will actually have to process all that before it starts rendering the page. If we place place the script tags in the body tags at the very end, then our page will render, and the user can read the main part of the page while the script tags are rendered. And generally, since there's a pause between when they see the information and when they click the button, usually the script tags will be loaded by the time they need them. So this is one way of getting your page to render perhaps a little faster. As in most things, whether to place them in the head block or the body really depends on what you want to do. So we placed our JavaScript in the onClick event. We've placed it in the head block, and we placed it in the body element of our HTML file. Another place we can place our JavaScript is in an external file. So what we can do is I'm going to add a JavaScript file. And you might have it down here, but if you don't, you can go to New Item, find JavaScript file, and we're going to call this one JS source file. And you'll see that JavaScript source file has been added into our root directory. And we can basically place any function we want here. So usually your source file will be a collection of functions. And I'm going to define one called myFunction. And just for the sake of an example, we're going to just return num1 times num2. So a fairly simple function. And then I'm going to add another HTML file. And we'll call this one jsextern.html. And we'll put in a few inputs so that we have some information we can work on. We'll use an ID field. We'll also have a button. And what this button is going to do is, in the onClick, we're going to get the result field, and we're going to set its inner HTML equal to the value stored in text box number 1 And we're going to use that function. So it's going to be my function. My function takes two elements. So text box, we're going to put in text box 1 and text box num2. And let's see, we need to make sure that everything's open and closed properly. So here's my function, open parentheses. That should be the closed parentheses for that one. And then we need to close this tag. And then what we have to do is we need to reference this JavaScript source file. Otherwise, you can't see my function. And we can do that in the script tag. We can place the script tag either in the head block or the body. And we have a source attribute. And you notice the nice thing about Visual Studio is the IntelliSense helps you out. So here we can see that we can link to this JavaScript source file. And our button will use that source file. So now we have two inputs, text box num1 and text num1 and text num2. And we have a span here called result. And so the inner HTML of result will be set to whatever my function returns when we pass it the value at text box 1 and text box 2. And if we look at that function, it should get both those values and return those two values multiplied by each other. So let's give it a try. And the results, let's see, we'll put 5 and 6, click submit, and we get 30. So we see it does work, and we are in fact able to put our functions in an external file, which can neaten up our code considerably. So using an external file makes a lot of sense, especially if you're going to share files among multiple HTML pages or functions along multiple HTML pages. So similar to the way we put things that are going to be common across the entire project in a separate CSS file, you would do the same thing with JavaScript, and you should put things that are going to be common among multiple pages in your JavaScript file. Now that we know where to place our JavaScript, another important thing we need to be able to do is debug our JavaScript. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to create yet another HTML page. And we'll call it debugging.html. And we'll just put a little bit of a program in here. With the script tag. And we're creating a few variables and with a formula in our script. And we're going to demonstrate how to use the console log function. And what this is useful for is displaying results so that you can see them when the JavaScript runs without necessarily having to show them in the form itself. So this is the console log function. And we'll run this page. And you can see that, well, we have this log, but where does it show up? Well, again, we're going to use our F12 developer tools. When I hit F12, you'll see that this console in the developer tools, you have this section that says console. And that's where our output will show up. So here where it says console.log, obviously 5 plus 6 will be 11, C should be 11, and that's where our console output came out. So this is a useful way to help. That's a useful feature for debugging. You can look at your intermediate values and just have them displayed on the console, and they won't be shown on the main page. Another thing that we can do is we have the debugger directive. If we just type debugger, you notice it's highlighted in blue here, and we run the program again. It doesn't do anything initially. You have to hit F12 to bring up your developer tools, and then rerun the program by refreshing your browser. And when you do that, if the developer tools are open, it will stop execution where you place the keyword debugger, and it'll show your code over on the right here. So now you can step through, and you have step over and you have resume execution. So you could put several debugger directives, but here we can step through and we can see that you can see the execution one line at a time. In fact, you have them over here as well. And we can just step over, and we get the console.log, and if we hit continue, resume, it'll resume execution, and it finishes. So this is one way you can debug with JavaScript. Another thing we can do with JavaScript is work with forms, and this is a little more unusual. Normally, you wouldn't necessarily use JavaScript quite this way, but we're going to just experiment with it and just to show how a form works. And so we're going to add an HTML page, and we're just going to call it input form .html. And I'm going to create this code, and it basically consists of a field set inside of a form. And the way the form works is the action attribute in a form field is the page that you want to open up when this form gets submitted. And we need a input of type a submit button, basically. And that's what this button will be here. And we have two input fields. And we have to specify the method. We can use get or post. Unfortunately, with JavaScript, we cannot get fields from a form using post. And we will talk about posting forms when we look at, you need something like PHP or ASP.NET or .NET MVC in order to process a post form. Basically, you need to use server-side code. But we can use client-side code, JavaScript, with a get form, which will take each of these inputs in the field set and we'll add them to a query string when we use the get method that we'll see in the actual URL of the page. And so we're going to need a second form as well, which will be our response form. So I'm going to add another HTML page and call it response.html. And just as an example of what happens, let's just run this as it is. And there's our form. It's not very pretty, but it'll work. And I'm just going to click, I'm going to put some numbers here. Maybe a 7 and an 8. And we click submit. And you'll notice up here, this section of the URL, when it goes to response to HTML, it adds a question mark, and then it adds the fields from our field set. The first one is first num, and the second one is second num. So you can see the name is placed here, and then it equals, and then whatever the current value is put after the equal sign, and then they're separated by an and. So if you had more than one input, you would see them all show up here. The submit is not shown, it's just submit it. It just causes this this page to open up and these values to be passed through the query string. And this isn't really a great way of passing data from one page to another because it's kind of ugly looking, and it shows it kind of shows the information behind the scenes, and sometimes the stuff it's not things that you want to actually show. So normally we prefer to use a post method, but if we needed to, for some reason, use JavaScript and want to process this all server or client side, then you could do this. And so then how can we process that data? Well, in the response, we could perhaps add some places to show the data. And so we're going to add a span tag, which which is just the query string. And we're going to see if we can pull the query string out using JavaScript. And using the document object, we're going to use the document object to get the query string span tag, and so we can set its inner text. But we can use the window object in JavaScript to get the URL or the href of wherever this page is. And so this code right here, this href property, will give us the queries, will give us actually the whole URL. And so we're going to run this, we're going to save this, and we're going to go back to our input form and run it again. And I'm going to put maybe 5 and 9 and click submit. And you can see that this href returns the whole URL. It's everything that's up in here. So that's useful as a starting point, but we need to process this a little bit more in order to get the query string out. And so you can write some code, and there are several examples of this online. The one I'm looking for that I'm using is from Stack Overflow input. And it's this input here, how can I get query string values in JavaScript? And there's several examples in here of way people have done it, and there's some advantages and disadvantages to each approach. But for our purposes, this will work fine. And we're going to add, first off, in our response, we're going to add a few tags. So we're going to add a couple spans to store our first and second numbers, and then something to store the sum. And then we need to change our script so that it can pick those things up. So first I'm going to bring in that function. So we'll define that function here so that when the script runs, it'll get the query string and throw it in. And then this function, basically what it uses regular expressions, and you can read about the regular expressions in W3 Schools, and it will give you the summary for it. So I'm going to bring in this function from Stack Overflow, and I'm going to just place it here in the script tag. And what this function does is it uses the regular expressions in order to define the pattern that we want to pull of the data we want to pull out, and it'll get the parameter by name. We pass in the name of the parameter we want, and it'll pull it out if it can find it, and it'll return null if it can't find it, and give us what the actual value is. In addition, we need to populate our fields, so we'll put some more JavaScript in. And what we're doing is we're getting the first num and second number by using this getParameter function, and then we'll get the inner text of our first. We'll get a reference to the inner text of our first number and second number span fields up here, and we'll just put those values in. And then to get the sum, we'll just add the two together and place that into the sum text. So this function here basically allows us to pull the information out of the query string. And so I'll go back and I'll run this again and see if it works. And so I'm going to put in 7 and 9 and click submit, and we get 79. Why do we get 79? Well, what happens is that when we did this addition here, you have to be careful with JavaScript because it's not a strongly typed language. If you say add and you happen to have just brought in things as text, which is what this getParameterByName function will do when it pulls out the values, we need to convert those into actual numeric values before we can do our math. And we can do that by, I'm just going to use parse int. We could also use parse float. And so we'll use a conversion function to convert our JavaScript into numbers, and then try it again. And we can see now that the addition function is working just fine, and so our JavaScript is working. A note on JavaScript, you often have to put a lot of guards in front of your code in order to make sure that things are of the right type. And you have to do much more validation than what we're doing in these sample programs. But these are just here to show you the basic workings of JavaScript. So those are the fundamentals of using JavaScript and how to use them in your HTML program. Once you have those fundamentals, it's easy to then go through, say, the W3 Schools tutorials. And some of the ones I recommend looking at are the output exercise. If you're not familiar with JavaScript variables, look at the variable exercise. I notice that in JavaScript we use the var keyword, and while normally in a strongly typed language, you'd actually have a particular type. You will also want to, it's also useful to look at the regular expressions page and the forms validation. Under forms here, this JS Forms is really about how to use JavaScript for validation, which is really one of the more primary uses of it. And so I recommend doing this exercise here as well. Normally, you want to use JavaScript to validate your form before it goes back to the server. And later on, we'll learn how to use server-side code to actually process our forms. But before they submit, it's useful to make sure that the form is validated before you move on. And then and there's also one on the Forms API, which has some things that can make validation easier. There's also many other links. For example, the style guide is up here somewhere. It's useful to read that and the best practices. And if you're already familiar with coding, you can look through some of these other elements, but you probably already know how to do loops and conditionals and declare variables and do assignments. So you probably just need to look through these other tutorials somewhat quickly. Looking at the way objects are stored in JavaScript is useful. It's if you already know how to if you already know object-oriented programming, then this won't be much of a surprise. There's some slight differences. And looking at the DOM object, the document object model, and seeing what events are available and what you can get out of each of the tags. You can get access to all the attributes in a document objects tag, and that means you can change them or you can look up their values. And then the browser model, which gives us access to the window and history and all kinds of other things. So you want to look at those to become familiar with how to take advantage of those. But if you already know how to code, then it's just a matter of finding the objects that you need to modify to do what you need to do. And Ajax is something we'll look at later on, but that's, if you want to look at preview, that's useful as well. So this concludes my presentation on JavaScript. Thank you.